Hello everyone, this is CounterYolo, bringing you another video talking about survivability in Star Trek Online. And in this video, I'm going to be going over rock, paper, scissors as it relates to different types of classes inside of Star Trek Online, and explain how each class can technically be superior to a different other class inside of the game, depending upon if things are even and such things. In this video, I'm going to be covering the basics of how rock, paper, scissors works, the strengths and weaknesses of each class, giving a brief assumptions in terms of what the baselines are going to be before I talk about each class, because I feel that that's fairly important because you're really going to see one particular class beating another very particular class inside of the game, or that you might not technically consider that actually beating that other class. But at the very end, I'll also cover a super brief TLDW for those three classes, alongside with my particular opinions as to if you're going to be a tank captain, what professions, in my opinion, should you actually be going for. Alright, so obviously like normal, timelines will be in the description, and let's go ahead and get started. So for rock, paper, scissors, it's an ancient Chinese game. It's been around for a very long time, and in that game you have two people playing. They randomly pick one of three things: rock, paper, or scissors. Rock beats scissors, scissors beats paper, and paper beats rock. If you actually go into ancient Chinese customs and things, paper over rock symbolized disgrace or defeat. And that's why in the ancient Chinese cultures, that's why paper is better than rock. Now, in terms of Star Trek Online, you might not totally agree with this. Totally cool. But for this analogy, rock is going to be tactical, simply because it's the most popular one for most players to take in Star Trek Online. And rock, paper, scissors, it also happens to be the most popular pick as well. Scissors is going to be science. It is the least picked inside of rock, paper, scissors, as well as in Star Trek Online. And then of course paper, which could be your engineers. It's the second most picked. Also kind of the second most picked in Star Trek Online. Now, in our versus matchups that I'm going to be going through with every single one of these classes, there's going to be these assumptions here. First off, everyone's going to be on an equal skill level. Now, this is not just raw skill and piloting, but also that everyone's going to be at level 65. Alongside that, everyone is going to be using the same gear mark and rarity for the stuff, whether that's very rare Mark 12, ultra rare Mark 15, or even epic Mark 15 for everything. The third assumption is that this is going to be a 1v1 challenge situation. It's going to be this one captain versus this one other captain. It's not going to be a group of 5v5 because there's a lot of other strategy involved with creating a team of 5 or a team of 3 or a team of 10 or 20, whatever. When it comes to a lot of these different classes, in terms of the combinations that might work extremely well and what might not work in others. My last assumption is that each class will be in its class kind of specific and kind of intended ship. So tactical will be in escorts, engineering captains will be in cruisers, and science captains will be in science vessels. Alright, so let's go into our first battle, which will be tactical versus science. Now in this one, if you actually compare a lot of the damage between these two classes, they both do a very high amount of damage, but their damage is quite different. Tactical captains have a very high consistent damage with cannons, or like dual heavy cannons, those types of things. Science does a lot more spike damage in terms of torpedoes and exotic damage. A lot of torpedoes that they would use would be ones that enhance exotic damage further. Feel free to see my science video showing you an example tank build that does have a lot of elements of your typical science builds inside of the game. Because both these types of damage are actually very effective against each other, we actually need to look at something else to determine who's actually going to win, and that comes down to maneuverability. Your escorts are obviously going to have a higher speed and have higher maneuverability than your standard science vessel inside the game. There are notable exceptions, like the Colony Lucari Tier 6 Scout ship. That one's basically on par with any of your tactical escorts, and so in that case, it would just come down to who's a better pilot. But when we're talking about the general scenario, it's going to be that your tactical guy will be able to outmaneuver the science vessel. And since science vessels need to stay within the 135-degree arc for a lot of their science abilities in the front, or with a 90-degree arc, as I've shown up at the very top for a lot of their torpedoes to enhance their science abilities, science has a much harder time executing their exotic DPS on a tactical captain. While tactical captains can do a lot of their bobbing and weaving, moving in and out of the 10-degree arc, even generally for science captains, and still get a lot of their energy damage off. So in total, tactical can avoid a lot of the science damage, and science will be able to they'll kind of be forced to take the brunt of the tactical damage, and as thus, tactical is going to beat science. The general strategy behind tactical captains is pretty simple. I'm going to get as much damage as possible to defeat you as quickly as possible so you don't have any time to retaliate whatsoever. Now, when we get into a lot of the tactical stuff inside of the game, they obviously have the strongest damage and thus the strongest potential for threat generation inside of the entire game. Because they are so heavily invested in damage, though, they are the weakest in terms of damage recovery as well as damage negation. They're obviously going to be complementing escorts very well, very strong versus science vessels, a lot weaker versus cruisers actually. And I'll get into that later in that battle. In terms of tactical powers, they're very limited in terms of recovery and negation. I kind of said tactical initiative kind of helped with recovery by getting more cooldowns faster so that they could get a lot of their abilities off, which some might be survival as well. Go down fighting is technically a damage negation ability, but because this ability also gives you damage resistance rating and that you have a trait which allows this to be spammable, this is actually more of an additional DPS enhancer, and so it gives you a lot more threat generation for tanks as well. However, the biggest things here for tactical captain, is going to be attack pattern alpha and tactical fleet. A lot of times for tactical captains, this is why you pick tactical versus the other ones, because you get a lot of bonus damage for yourself as well as for your entire team. Target optics and strike team is the exact same thing for ground. And obviously fire my mark is the exact same stuff and everything besides the symbol for space and ground. Overall, tactical is fairly straightforward for both space and ground. A lot of your tactics are going to be the exact same. So tactical is a very simple one. Just deal a lot of damage really quickly. Alright, so for our second battle, it's going to be science versus engineering. Now this one's going to be fairly interesting as well, because science has a lot of high spike damage, and engineering does a lot of more moderate, consistent damage, because they also often do energy damage, they do beam fire will, those types of things. Because it's just a moderate amount of damage, it's actually a lot of this is not actually going to get through the very high amount of shields, and of how highly shield resistant a lot of science vessels actually are inside the game. However, science vessels, because they have very high spike damage, and they have a lot of abilities that will lower the damage resistance rating of opponents that they'll be fighting, they'll be extremely effective versus engineering cruisers. Not to mention that since they have higher maneuverability than engineering cruisers, they will be able to get inside of their 135-degree arc and 90-degree arc for their various abilities and weapons to be able to execute a lot of those exotic spike damage inside of the game. As thus, science will be able to easily withstand the engineering DPS that they're getting, while engineers will have a very hard time withstanding the science spike damage inside of the game. As a side note here, a lot of the buffing that occurred going into Victory is Life actually was buffing a lot more of the science enemies inside of the game, giving them a lot more spike damage and those types of things. And that includes stuff like, the Borg. A lot of stuff that the Borg does deals with science abilities. So just something to think about, but yes, overall science is going to beat engineering cruisers inside of the game. The general philosophy for science is also decently simple. They're going to slowly like disable you, lower your resistances and stuff, so that they become the most effective fighter in the two people that you're fighting. In terms of science abilities, they're obviously going to be. They overall have the best damage negation in the entire game. The biggest thing for that is an ability called subnucleonic beam. This is actually the main reason why science is extremely effective in terms of tanking in space. Because subnucleonic beam reduces incoming damage from a particular target by 75%. Now, to give you a very brief example, let's say you have an enemy that's about to shoot you with 1 million points of damage. If you hit them with subnucleonic beam, that that 1 million points of damage is now 250,000 damage, which for a tank, I mean, I'm a tank captain, so I can easily tell you this, 250,000 damage, it's high, but it's manageable to survive through. 1 million, nope. It's either going to trigger invincible on your ship, or you're just going to die from it. There's really just no real good way around that. So science captains are actually the best at surviving a lot of that spike damage inside the game, which is the most difficult thing to handle currently inside of the Victory is Life meta. Alongside that, their initial power, co-opt energy weapons, is an additional, fairly nerfed but AoE energy weapon specific version of subnucleonic beam. Just to put it fairly simply, neural neutralizer on the ground is an AoE placate to stop enemies from attacking you when you get way too much threat. A lot of times from a lot of your AoE ground abilities, which most science captains are going to have. I mentioned alongside that, for your tank killing abilities, sensor scan in space and tricorder scan on ground, significantly lowers the damage resistance rating of something that you're fighting. Obviously, science vessels complement science captains in general, but science captains are also decently effective in cruisers as well as escorts too. But science captains are extremely strong versus cruisers, and a lot weaker versus escorts, because science vessels, if you don't have every shield, you're going to die. And escorts are fairly good at bursting through shields. And also the escorts can outmaneuver a lot of their damage, and so they're going to be a lot less effective. Alright, so let's get into our last battle, which is paper versus rock, or engineering versus tactical. So in this scenario, we have engineering and tactical guys, which engineering does medium consistent damage, while tactical does very high consistent damage. Engineers couldn't survive science because it was very high spike damage, but tactical doesn't really do a lot of spike damage, and a lot of their spike damage isn't stuff, a lot of which is going to be going through shields. You might have some tactical torpedo vessels, but even for a lot of them, that spike damage isn't typically going to be enough, even if it's stuff that bypasses shields, to be able to take down an engineering cruiser in one shot. And engineers will be able to just use a lot of their insane amount of regenerative abilities and passive regen to be able just to get back into the fight. If you actually look at the base regen values of escorts versus science vessels versus engineers, the engineering cruisers have the highest of those three different general categories. Overall, what this means is that despite the fact that they have lower maneuverability, tactical engineers are still going to be able to hit each other whenever the tactical escorts are in range, which basically means that in a 1v1 situation, the tactical escort's obviously going to be the one that's controlling the situation, but when tactical escorts keep on going out for their strafing runs, it's not going to make much of a dent versus the cruiser. So what a tactical escort is actually going to have to do to take down an engineering cruiser is stay within that 10 kilometers for a very long time to try to burst down the engineering cruiser by exhausting all of his or her survival consoles alongside all of his abilities within about a 4-minute time span. Which, since I have a lot of experience doing 1v1s versus the highest PvP escorts in the game versus my own PvE cruiser, this is not really going to happen. Just going to put it out that way. It's either going to be a tie because the tactical escort gives up and has to move out of the 10-kilometer range to not die from me, or the tactical escort will stay in range and will eventually die to me. Sometimes I don't use abilities filled with just to try to lure them into a false sense of their security, and I sometimes will eventually kill them doing it that way. But yeah, overall, an engineer may not necessarily always beat a tactical escort, but they'll always be able to nullify them in an actual battle. And that's the philosophy of engineers. They are there specifically to try to nullify or distract a very powerful enemy so that they aren't really defeating anyone else in your battle. That's what they're about. In space, that definitely means via tanking. On ground, that more veers towards weapon disables and disarms, movement impairments, a lot of those types of things instead of actual raw tanking stuff. Because hey, there's no point in needing to be able to tank if, for instance, none of the enemies can actually attack. And none of the enemies can attack, they won't do any damage, so you don't have to actually withstand damage. Weapon disables is much less prevalent in space combat, so you have to veer a lot more towards tanking in space, and that's why you have your engineering cruisers with those command abilities. Alright, so for abilities themselves for engineering, they're obviously going to have the strongest damage recovery in the entire game. Obviously, they complement cruisers, fairly strong versus escorts, as I just described, and the weak versus science vessels, because science vessels are basically the tank killing machines inside the game. For recovery, especially at the budget end and even at the high end, miraculous repairs, also referred to in the past as miracle worker, is the standard extremely strong ability in the game that you should be having on your power bar if you're an engineering captain. For space and ground, your main negation abilities can be rotate shield frequency, which most people completely ignore inside the game. And on ground, you have reroll power to shields, which is basically the exact same thing. Unfortunately, your corresponding ability for space for miraculous repairs is actually cover shield on the ground, which is extremely unfortunate. Simply because what you end up happening is that, like, cover shield is an extremely situational ability, while miraculous repairs is a much more well-rounded. When I'm close to dying, I'm going to use this. So, because of this, engineers will often veer more towards a turret type build with a lot of fabrications. Even though if you're actually going to try to really be a tank and doing a lot more of the disabling route, because that's what you have to do, you actually aren't going to be using turrets anyway. When it comes to threat generation in space, at least, though, you do have a couple of options. If you put together these three abilities together, EPS power transfer, Nadion inversion, and intrusive energy redirection, you're basically not going to have any power drain whatsoever and a very high amount of power in general on your ship. Now, technically, Nadion inversion is really meant for using whenever you're getting hit by a shield drain ability, but it also gives you a lot of weapon cost reduction for that duration too, which can also amplify EPS power transfer and intrusive energy redirection as well. For those of you that don't know much about engineering, basically intrusive energy redirection is basically a clickable ability that kind of acts as another plasmonic leech for your character that just lasts for a short amount of time. It's okay, but there definitely are better abilities out there. So for our TLDW kind of slide / my opinions on these classes in terms of tanking, tactical is obviously the full-on offensive playstyle, going guns blazing. Obviously, they're very weak to engineering because they are typically not going to be able to like burst them down, and they are the best in threat generation. Science has the most versatile playstyle. They're basically good at everything. They're relatively weak to tactical, but they have the best damage negation of any class in the entire game. For engineering, that's very much a defensive playstyle. They're fairly weak to science, and they have the best damage recovery in the entire game. So, for my personal recommendation for space and ground tanking, what am I going to choose? My number one is actually science. Now, it's true, I've only been playing science for a couple of months now, ever since Victory is Life came out, but I don't know any way to really push down science. You can literally play any playstyle in the entire game. Like, you're still pretty good as an escort, in a science vessel, in a cruiser. All those playstyles work pretty well. You're fairly effective as a science tank as well, especially as a Romulan. In the Romulan battle cloak tanks, you're actually pretty good as well. Beam tanks, you actually work fairly well as well, because I'm sure you don't have that extra survival ability stuff, but hey, you can reduce the damage coming in on you from a powerful enemy by 75% for a few seconds, which in many cases is much more valuable than having maybe another 33% shield resistance. That reducing the enemy damage scales much better than having a lot more resistances on your own ship. Not to mention, on the ground, you have a lot of AoE threat abilities. Not to mention, you have your own medical tricorder, which, since you're going to be temporal operative primary probably anyway, it'll be down to about a 4-second cooldown, which medical strike quarters, medical vanguard thing gives you perfect shields for 4 seconds, which basically means in ground combat you have perfect shields the whole time, which is pretty nice. There also are a few revive type healing abilities as well in ground combat, which makes them extremely strong healers that can also serve as tanks as well inside of ground combat. They can basically do everything in ground as well. Healing, tanking, doing DPS, they can do everything in space and ground combat. No one else in the game can actually do that. That's why they're my number 1. Number 2 is going to be tactical. Now, it's true that they have a lot of disadvantages when it comes to real tanking because they have a lot less damage negation and damage recovery. But in space, they're able to negate that significantly through just using a cruiser and getting a lot of survival abilities and bridge officer survival abilities on their ship. They can also serve as an off tank as well fairly effectively too. On ground, on the other hand, this is a little broken in my opinion. Because of the scaling inside of the game, the draw fire kit module ability has scaled literally to the point that if all you had for cooldowns for ground kit modules was the chronometric capacitor from the temporal reputation, which is 7.5% cooldown reduction on kit module abilities, at very rare and ultra rare, like your draw fire kit module thing will give you additional threat generation and damage distance rating for like 45 seconds, and it'll be on a 40.9 second cooldown. So, like, the duration is longer than the cooldown. So you can literally have your draw fire threat generation up practically all the time for tactical. Considering that threat generation is like almost like if you have it on ultra rare, it's almost 3,000 threat generation, plus over 100 damage resistance rating on your character, which is basically another armor slot, basically, that you're adding to your character. It's very, very strong for threat generation and damage negation. For ground, it makes tactical extremely effective on ground. Plus the fact that they're pretty good in space as well is why they are my number 2 spot. My last spot is going to be engineering, sadly. In space, they're still definitely going to be on my go-to list for space combat, especially when I'm going into a PvP setting. I extremely value having those extra survival options to me, just because a lot of stuff can get blown through really fast in a 5v5 setting. Having those extra survival options is pretty valuable, because in PvP battle, what you're wanting to have happen is people focus you for a little bit because they see a cruiser, then they realize that they actually can't kill the cruiser, and then they focus everyone else, which means you can use all of your survival consoles and abilities on your other fellow captains, which means that they basically have like potentially double the survival stuff for their ship. So that it's overall going to be much harder anyway for the enemy to actually defeat your team, which means that it's much easier for your team to win. So in space, I'll still veer towards engineering. On ground, though, it's very limited as to what situation you would actually want an engineer. Most of the time, it's for your stationary tanking and protecting a certain target for a period of time situations is when you would actually have an engineer. It's for this particular reason as to why I feel in a lot of missions you'll still have these going on inside of the game, simply because then it still feels okay to be an engineer. If you do a lot of constant moving around in a ground operation, which most of them is a lot of moving around, engineers don't feel as great. You have to use like kit modules like sabotage in order to feel anywhere near relevant to the science and tactical captains that you're fighting with. But anyway, those are just my personal opinions on all this stuff. Feel free to like and dislike for whatever you wish in the comments below. Feel free to subscribe if you really like this content. If you like stuff to talk about survivability, tanking, aside search for Trek Online, or if it's interested in my occasional rants talking about the upcoming Age of Discovery expansion that'll be coming out soon, feel free to subscribe as well. Typically, at least every week, there's probably some announcement, which means there's probably a video from me talking about those types of things inside of the game. Thank you all for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.